Thank you, Lorena, for the excellent presentation. So we'll just proceed with Jim's presentation on harmonization of regulation. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Keller, and it's an honor to participate in the IFMBE-CED webinar on health technology regulation challenges. I will be talking on global harmonization of medical device regulations and processes. Here's a summary of the presentation that I'll be giving today. I'll get into brief personal and organizational background, that is, background on the organization that I work for. Then I'll provide an overview of device regulatory processes around the world and the challenges that we've had with the historically fragmented regulatory framework for those processes. And that will lead into a discussion of global harmonization, which is an ideal solution to what has historically been what I would call regulatory chaos. And then I'll get into some examples of harmonization efforts and provide some perspectives for clinical engineers and wrap up with some useful resources. So many of you may recognize me. I am a biomedical engineer. I worked for 34 years for ECRI Institute, where I directed ECRI's medical device evaluation program for about 20 years and also ran its medical device problem reporting and recall management systems for many years. I was involved and led ECRI's third-party 510K review program and have had heavy involvement, or did have heavy involvement, in the development and ongoing maintenance of ECRI Institute's UMDNS, or Universal Medical Device Nomenclature System. I am honored to be a past president of ACCE and had the pleasure of joining Emergo by UL a year ago, or a little over a year ago, after a long and fulfilling career at ECRI Institute. The organization that I now work for is called Emergo by UL. We are part of the Underwriters Laboratories organization. We're located in Austin, Texas, although I live and work out of my home in Pennsylvania, and near where I used to work at ECRI. The focus of what Emergo does is provide services for medical device and in vitro diagnostic industries. The scope of services would be market access, that is, helping those companies get access to markets around the world through regulatory affairs and quality assurance advisory services, for example, through support with regulatory strategy and registrations, and with quality management system processes. We have a human factors research and design division, as well as software compliance and cybersecurity divisions that help companies comply with the requirements associated with human factors and software compliance and cybersecurity. We also provide a lot of support for companies with clinical research, and we have a new regulatory affairs management suite digital platform for regulatory intelligence and tools. And it's a great place to go for a lot of helpful free resources about the regulatory world, which I'll be touching on during this presentation. So the medical device regulatory process around the world, it has a predominant regulatory framework from the US and the EU, and in the EU it's currently under the Medical Device Directive, or In Vitro Diagnostic Directive, and will soon be governed by the Medical Device Regulations and the In Vitro Diagnostic Regulations. Each national regulatory authority has its own system that may or may not be based on US or EU systems, and may often actually be pharma-based. That is, the Medical Device Regulatory Authority is a pharma-based entity within a government. When thinking about medical device regulations, there are several things that you need to consider. First off, it's not just about infusion pumps and patient monitors, but covers in vitro diagnostics, which are considered medical devices, and also combination products, for example, implantable infusion pumps. There are pre-market and post-market phases, and particularly going forward under the soon-to-be enacted medical device regulations or soon-to-be followed medical device regulations, there is heavy new emphasis on the post-market process. There is more and more consideration around non-traditional healthcare settings, like in patient homes, and more considerations in the regulatory process, excuse me, around new technology or technology issues. So for example, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and human factors. So the historically fragmented regulatory framework that I referred to before has a number of challenges associated with it. There are different regulatory processes for each country a manufacturer sells to, and you can just picture yourself being in a medical device manufacturer's shoes where you have to comply with many different regulations around the world. It drives up your costs and is extremely inefficient. There's limited to no sharing of important information, or there has been limited to no sharing of important information, especially in the post-market phase. For example, where events are happening in one country and not necessarily having that information shared in another country where that information would be useful and help reduce patient safety in the other country. There are often inconsistent and potentially conflicting requirements. There are plenty of examples of where one country will have as its regulation an older version of a standard, and another country will have adopted a newer version of a standard. There are totally different languages and terminologies applied within regulatory entities around the world, and this all contributes, including standards of care for safety across regions. And one simple example would be commentary that you would hear from a medical device manufacturer to say, hey, let's go sell in the European Union first because it's an easier path to entry into the market than to the United States. That's actually going to be changing quite a bit as the MDR gets into effect, because the rules under MDR are actually more stringent than they are in the United States going forward. So global harmonization is an ideal solution to the regulatory chaos that I referred to before. And it involves collaboration of international regulatory authorities to harmonize on processes, standards, terminology, and rules and regulations. The most active and probably well-known harmonization efforts are under the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. Other example harmonization activities include those being conducted by the WHO, Southeast Asia Regulatory Network, Pan-African Harmonization Working Party, Eurasian Economic Union Medical Device Agreement, the Medical Device Single Audit Program, and various medical device registries, which are working on integrating their information to help improve patient care. There has been excellent progress to date in global harmonization. However, there's so much more to do. Simple examples are countries needing to confirm who they can talk to, that is what countries, other regulatory authorities they can talk to, and whether or not they have, say, confidentiality language that allows them to share confidential information across countries. Keeping up with regulatory changes can be daunting. As I've referred to, there are new regulations in the European Union which are significantly different than the older medical device directives, and keeping up with that and harmonizing that across countries can be very challenging. Same with changes to technical standards. And then what many countries are dealing with regarding harmonization is how they can harmonize, which is has obvious value, but not lose control with what's going on in their country by solely relying on one particular country's regulations. Sorry for jumping ahead there for a moment. But here are some examples of harmonization efforts. The planned recognition of ISO 13485 Quality Management System Standard for medical devices by the US. I've been hearing that eventually the US will be adopting ISO 13485. The IMDRF has a number of work items associated with its efforts, And 3 examples are listed on this slide, including medical device clinical evaluations, so trying to standardize the process of evaluating data from clinical studies for medical devices, having standardized cybersecurity guidance that can be applied across the countries that participate in the IMDRF, and then similarly having common terminology associated with adverse events. The WHO is working on international classification, coding, and nomenclature of medical devices. And as I referred to before, here's an example of a collaboration of breast implant registries, so that the disparate data across breast implant registries is integrated to allow the clinicians who are using the registry data to take advantage of that information to improve on patient care. So I am well aware that most of the people who are listening in on this program are in the clinical engineering world, and I wanted to make sure that I shared some perspectives about the regulatory process for the clinical engineering world. First off, it's really important for you as the clinical engineer to understand the regulatory world in the country or region that you are living and working in. And to understand that, you need to realize that there are post-market, pre-market, and specific requirements often for hospitals. So there may be medical device reporting requirements within your country, or opportunities to report that may not necessarily be a requirement, but are voluntary efforts that you should know about, which can help to improve patient care and improve medical devices within your country or across the countries that your specific country may be cooperating with through a harmonization effort. Something to ask about is how regulatory processes apply to your jobs. Well, there are many examples, but 3 in particular come to mind. First is the work that clinical engineers perform associated with product evaluation, that is selecting medical devices for acquisition in their hospital. And the regulatory piece of it could involve interpreting codes and standards that apply to a medical device that are mandated by a specific regulatory authority, or reviewing the clinical research from a regulatory submission. Being able to review that clinical research can be really valuable in helping to interpret how suitable a particular product would be for the hospital that you work in. Understanding the process of incident reporting and investigation associated with medical devices is critical in the role of a clinical engineer in a hospital, and that often ties in to the requirements or the voluntary efforts that have been put in place within a country's specific regulatory authority. And then many of you have been involved in managing recalls associated with medical devices, and it's important to understand how your country processes and expects medical device manufacturers to process recalls, and what your responsibilities should be associated with the processing of recalls. And then lastly, it's important to learn about and understand the regulatory resources that are available associated with your country, your region, or just more broadly. There are a lot of resources out there to help you interpret what needs to be done by medical device companies and what needs to happen in the post-market phase, which clinical engineers and hospitals really need to be participating in. So it would be remiss of me to give a presentation in this day and age without bringing up COVID-19. And there are some very important COVID-19 related clinical engineering perspectives specifically associated to the topic of today, which is regulatory aspects of medical devices, including the harmonization of medical device regulations. And you need to keep in mind that some countries are now fast tracking certain medical devices with temporary, and I bold temporary for an important reason, emergency use authorizations. So these do not last, these authorizations. Example countries that have these kinds of authorizations would be the United States, Mexico, and Brazil. Some typical devices would be ones that are specifically associated with treating patients who have COVID-19, which would be ventilators, PPE, and COVID-related in vitro diagnostic tests. And it's really important for you to be aware that there is less scrutiny in the pre-market process for emergency use pathways. As a result, I've got some key recommendations, which is you need to understand your country's COVID-19 related emergency use process. You need to find out which products in your hospital are cleared via the emergency use authorizations. And then it's really important to pay attention, special attention, during incoming inspections for COVID-19 related temporarily approved products, keeping in mind that these products will have received less scrutiny than the traditional products, or the products that have gone through the traditional process. And another thing to keep in mind is that many of the companies that are selling these products under the emergency use authorizations have been companies that pivoted into the medical device space. So they may not have any experience in working in the medical device space. And I've worked with a number of those companies in my Emergo role. And you should just be thinking about the fact that they don't have that same deep experience that traditional medical device companies have. And so therefore things could slip through the cracks, and it's your responsibility, or partly your responsibility, to keep an eye out for problems that may come up associated with those temporarily approved products that, again, would not have received the same level of pre-market scrutiny as through the traditional process. I don't have a lot of time to get into this, so I'll just provide you with a listing of a number of useful resources that I thought of to include with this slide set. There are many, many more around the regulatory process and the regulatory world, but I wanted to highlight the FDA's website, the website for the Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration. The WHO has a lot of useful regulatory information, along with the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. And then I would be remiss from my employer's point of view to leave out Emergo by UL and some of the regulatory intelligence that we have on our website. And as I noted before, there is a lot of very useful and free information on the Emergo website. So you're welcome to check that out on Emergo's website. And this slide has just a couple of examples of the kind of resources that are freely available from Emergo. And these are process charts that explain the regulatory process for medical devices in Europe on the example on the left, and South Korea on the example on the right. And we have many more charts like this for other countries and regions around the world. So last thoughts that I wanted to bring up for my presentation today is related to leadership, and particularly associated with this topic, that is regulations and the harmonization of regulations around the world. It's really important for you to think about networking and get to know who to talk to within your country's regulatory authority, or who has connections to your country. If possible, volunteer for regulatory related activities, or join a local regulatory and or medical device related organization to just better understand what the regulatory environment is like in your country or a region. And I would challenge many of you to become your hospital's go-to or point person on regulatory matters. I can't think of anybody in a hospital who would be more qualified to be the point person for regulatory matters about medical devices than people in clinical engineering. Your colleagues need help interpreting regulations and standards and understanding how that impacts their world. And you are well qualified to do that as a clinical engineer in your hospital. And then probably most importantly is you need to plan for change, because when it relates to the world of regulations, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen again and again. So with that, I will say thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this presentation, and please feel free to reach out to me with questions or comments. Unfortunately, I won't be available for this program live, but I'd be happy to receive any comments or questions about this presentation at james.keller@ul.com. So thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone.